Odin kunni då idrott, mästermåtter fylgde, och framde sjálfur Seiðr heiter. En av tvi måtte han vita örlög manna och uordna hluti, så och att gera mönnum bana, eda uhamingu, eda vanheilindi, så och att taka fra mönnum vit, eda affel och gefa ödrum. Odin knew that sport with which the greatest power followed, and practiced it himself. It is called Seiðr. From this power he could know the fate of man and things that had not yet happened. He could give death or misfortune or bad health. He could take wit or strength from people and give it to others. Not quite like living humans, but endowed with a certain life and purpose, animated and empowered through acts of magic and spell songs and the help of supernatural powers. And I think it is likely that the story of the three men who were placed within the grave and later retrieved and worshipped as images of the god Freyr may be a story with themes and points that originated in a clearly pre-Christian pagan worldview, a worldview that held more in common with distant religious traditions elsewhere, such as voodoo, than it held with the European Christian one. And so, what about the story of the three men being taken to different temples and worshipped as the god that they had accompanied into the grave? Well, it is not far-fetched in my mind, at least, to wonder if such sacrificed wooden substitutes for men, especially after having journeyed through the hereafter and back, they had gone into the grave and returned. Well, this may have been regarded as particularly powerful and suitable for making wooden statues of the gods. So, we have come to the last part about Saur, the dog king. Yes, there is yet another story involving the transferring of wit. In this case, we're not speaking of a tree man or a dead body, we are speaking of a dog. A dog who was given the wit of three men and made into the king of the Thránds. Saur, the dog king, is perhaps not very close to being a true story. Perhaps not very close at all. But as stories go, it is an entertaining one. And once it was told, it evidently gained popularity, understandably. Because the Thránds had turned out to be particularly reluctant to commit to the new religion. And it's not unthinkable that this story originally may have been meant to ridicule and humiliate the Thránds, or to show how they managed to stand up to being humiliated. But you know, the Thránds, the people who let themselves be ruled by a dog, obviously this had some intentions of being humiliating. But however it is, there are different versions of this story, of the Canine monarch. One of the stories of this Canine monarch, this dog king, is referred to in Gesta Danorum, book 7, and another story is referred to in Håkon's saga Goda in the Heimskringla, and in Versu Noreg Bygdist. Apparently, this legendary canine reign happened during the reign of the Swedish king Øystein Beli, who may have been a historical person who ruled in Sweden around 790 and 810 AD. In the Gesta Danorum, Saxo Grammaticus does not mention Øystein. He speaks of a certain Gunnar who invaded Norway and killed more than he plundered. In order to humiliate the Norwegians after conquering their king, Ragnald, this horrible Gunnar appointed a dog as their ruler. So this was meant to humiliate the Norwegians. He also appointed governors to actually steer the kingdom, of course, and to take care of the anointed dog and let his nobles protect it. And he commanded that anyone who did not show the dog respect would be mutilated. Get a chop. So that's Saxo's version. In Håkon's saga Goda, we hear a different story, where Øystein Upplendinga konungur hin illi, which means the bad, that was his nickname, the bad. Well, he had conquered Trondheim and appointed his son Önund as his vassal king of the Thránds. And the Thránds, being rebellious, they rebelled and resumed power over their own land and killed the vassal king. So, Øystein, of course, returned and punished the rebellion by giving the Thránds two almost equally humiliating choices: to either elect his personal slave as their vassal king, a slave as king, or elect his dog, Saur. And the Thránds, well, it says in the saga that they reasoned that the dog would be easier to remove from power than the freed slave man, and they chose the dog. And it appears that the Thránds had a sense of humor and even liked their new king. For 3 years, the dog was treated like royalty, carried a necklace of gold, and even had his own throne. And while the story of Saur is funny, it also explains how the Thránds, who had obviously had a sense of humor, tricked the tyrant king further by making the dog actually capable of becoming king. And for this purpose, they made rituals of Seiðr, it says, for their new king, as it is said, and put the wit of 3 men into the canine mind. They chose the dog, it says. I'm going to read from the saga here. They chose the dog, for they thought he would allow them more autonomy. Yeah. And by Seiðr, they put 3 men's intelligence into the dog. And after that, the dog could bark 2 words and speak the 3rd word. So he had like 1/3 of human speech. He got a collar of gold and silver, and when the ground was muddy, the men carried him. They put up a high seat for him, and he sat, and it is very interesting, he sat on a haugur like other kings. That is, he sat on a burial mound like other kings. So obviously this was something that kings did, to sit on burial mounds. And he lived at Indre and had a farm. The dog had a farm. And that farm was situated near a burial mound, so that the place is called Saur's Mound. That was where he lay. And the saga reads, it is said that he had his bane when wolves attacked his herd, and the warriors teased him into defending his cattle. And he ran down the barrow towards the wolves, and they tore him to pieces at once. And the saga concludes, King Øystein did many other strange things to the Thránds, and many chiefs fled their homes and their inheritance because of his harrying and unpeace. So the last source about the dog king is in the saga called Versu Noreg Bygdist, how Norway was built. And it is said here that there was once a king called Øystein Beli who had a dog as a vassal king, and no more detail is given. So I think we get most of the detail from Håkon. However, the sources do seem to match and complete each other. When Danish Saxo writes about Norwegians instead of Thránds, it may be that the story had come to him by way of hearsay from people who, in the 13th century, no longer knew that Norway, at the time that is described here, was not a Norway, it was not a nation. It was just a region consisting of many smaller nations. So there was a distinction between the Thránds, for example, and people from other places like Vestfold or Hålogaland. But the Norwegian source, the Icelandic source, may be more aware when they speak of tribal conflict rather than conflicts between later and larger nations. In any way, it is only in the Håkonar saga that we find the version where the dog is not only placed as a symbolic vassal king in an attempt to humiliate the rebellious population. It also shows that this humiliation was turned to their advantage by the clever Thránds by the use of humor and irony. They started to treat the dog like, oh, this is Øystein's vassal king, all right. So they sort of turned the situation around. The humiliation was no longer so humiliating. And then they even trick the king when they give the dog the wit of 3 men. And it says very specifically that they use Seiðr in order to give the dog a human-like mind. Exactly how this was achieved is not explained, as usual. It is just said that it was an act of Seiðr. So, this was all for today. The next talk will be the last part of the harmful dark Seiðr chapter 5.4, where we'll talk about stories where spirits in some way or other are summoned in order to act on the magician's behalf, for better and for worse. Thank you so much for watching.